record. Okay, yes, it's recording. All right, so welcome everybody to this very special occasion, and I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Mercedes Valmisa. Mercedes is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Gettysburg College. She arrived at Gettysburg after getting a BA first in philosophy at the University of Seville in her native country of Spain, and then an MA in philosophy at National Taiwan University, where she wrote a prize-winning thesis on the Zhuangzi in Chinese, no less. And finally, she got her PhD in East Asian Studies at Princeton University, where she was trained not just in philosophy, but in early Chinese architecture and literature. She was part of what I think is a pretty good cohort at Princeton that included myself. And I can tell you from the numerous classes and reading groups that we had together that Mercedes is a careful translator and textual scholar working at the microscopic level, in addition to her skill as a philosopher working at the macroscopic scale. She's published numerous peer-reviewed articles in many important journals and edited volumes in English, Chinese, and Spanish. Some highlights include The Happy Slave Isn't Free, Relational Autonomy and Freedom in the Zhuangzi, The Reification of Fate in Early China, and What is a Situation? Most importantly for us today, though, Mercedes is also the author of this book, Adapting a Chinese Philosophy of Action, a very beautiful cover, which was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. As we'll hear soon, Adapting draws on scholarship in Chinese and Asian philosophy, Chinese studies, and the European tradition to reconstruct classical Chinese philosophers' strategies for efficacious relational action. And in doing so, the book accounts for the interdependent and embedded character of human agency, what we might call adaptive agency, or yin, yin wei to yin in classical Chinese. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Professor Mercedes Valmisa.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Tom, for your invitation. And, I'm sorry that I can't be there in person with you and with you all this time. I hope there will be more opportunities in the future, though. But I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm delighted to be with you all. So thank you so much for having me and for participating in this discussion, that an interesting discussion I hope we'll have after I finish the lecture portion. Excuse me. Okay, so I'll just get started. And I'm gonna start today by making a claim that may sound a little strange, and it's quite controversial, at least for philosophers, right? And the claim is that there is no such thing as an individual action. So every time that you do anything at all, right? Anytime that you read a book, or you go down the stairs, or you open a door, you are not the sole agent behind what you're doing. So you can be said to be participating in a process of co-action in which you are as much acting as acted upon, right? So I think, I would argue at least, that this could be a pretty acceptable claim for classical Chinese philosophers, but it can be also quite controversial, or it can be counterintuitive for those of us who are raised in Western contexts, right? Because there is a dominant tendency in the West, and by the West, I mean the Anglosphere and also certain countries in Europe, right? So there is a dominant tendency to buy into what has been called the myth of individualism. So the myth of individualism pretty much says that it's the notion that we are all individual from each other, that we are individual entities that are independent from each other, right? Also independent from the natural world, that we are self-governed, that we are self-reliant, right? So basically that we can do things by ourselves. And a prominent manifestation of individualism, especially as we see it manifested here in the US, is the American dream, right? And the American dream is what the late Lauren Berland called a form of cruel optimism. I don't know if you're familiar with that notion, cruel optimism. She defines it as a desire that becomes an obstacle to your own flourishing. So you desire something to be good and useful, good for you, but actually that thing that you desire ends up hurting you, right? It becomes a harm. With this notion of cruel optimism, then we can think of individualism as it is manifested, now particularly here in the US, so individualism promises prosperity and success for everyone, uniquely based on individual effort and merit, right? But then what it does is to deliver conditions that make that prosperity and success unattainable for everyone, except for a few privileged ones, right? So let me give you an example of how individualism would work as a form of cruel optimism. The example of the pandemic, right? Which the pandemic always, now it's an example for everything, and it works very well here still. So you remember, of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, many people across the world, but especially in what we call the Western world, of course, claimed their liberty, right? The right not to wear a mask, for example, or not to get vaccinated, right? So the exercise of this individual liberty then very quickly became an obstacle, not only to their own flourishing, but to everyone's flourishing, right? As we saw that the virus continued to spread much more than would have been necessary, with the effect that, you know, people couldn't go to their jobs, and children couldn't go to school, and so on and so forth, and many, many people died, right? As we are seeing now that with more and more people vaccinated, now things get better, right? So what is happening here then is that the performance of an ideology that is supposed to benefit the agent, right? So the performance of the ideology of individualism in this case, it's supposed to benefit the agent, but it actually brings about the opposite of what is intended, right? So that's the notion of cruel optimism. And so the question is, what if we can dispense with this way of framing reality, of looking at the world, right? This individualistic way of thinking, because it's a way of thinking after all, right? So I think academia has been doing that already for a while, for a long time, for decades, by replacing more notions related to individualism with the notion of relationality, right? From relationality. So relationality has become in academia in the past decades a tool to reshape both the humanities and the sciences. No? And you can see, for example, I have some examples here, very popular Deleuze and Guattari's notion of assemblages, right? Or Bruno Latour's notion of actor network theory. We have Donna Haraway's notion of posthumanism, or Karen Barat's in the sciences notion of entanglement, right? And this is only in the West, once again, right? In Europe and North America, because Asia actually has many more resources to think through relationality, for the simple reason that it has been doing it for a much longer time, right? Since the classical period. So there are many resources in the study of Asian thought to think through relationality, to replace that individualistic frame of reality with a more relational one. So along with classical Chinese philosophers, which is my specialty, right? Classical Chinese philosophy, I support a form of relational and process metaphysics that favors interrelations, interdependence, and interconnections, right? As opposed to supporting individual essences, right? And independent essences. So today, what I'm going to be doing in my talk, this is the introduction, I'm going to be trying to persuade you that we are co-constituted, co-acted, and codependent on others, right? So from the air that we breathe to the ground that affords our walking. And I'm going to be trying to persuade you also that if we start looking at the world in this way, then it can be very beneficial, right? It has the potential to make life better for everyone, not only humans, but also non-humans, all right? So with that said, then let's get to the real stuff here. Okay, so according to classical Chinese philosophers, humans and perhaps other animals are not the only entities with the capacity to act, okay? So as you may know, in the traditional Western notion of agency involves very centrally the notion of intentionality and subjectivity, okay? So to be an agent, you need to have the capacity to represent your intentions and your goals, and then to have the capacity to rationally choose means to achieve your goals, right? That's an agent. And that's what separates an action from an event, right? So it rains without anyone making it so or having a plan to do it so, and I write a book, and in my writing the book is a very intentional action, right? So that's the traditional notion of agency in Western philosophy, which is still very dominant today. Okay, it's not like this is unfashionable or anything like that. It's super dominant, right? So when I say that with classical Chinese philosophers that not only humans and some non-human animals can act, but also we are acted upon by everything around us, then that's subverting the traditional notion of agency in the West, right? So we are acted upon by everything, objects, right? Ideas, laws, genes, rules, norms, social roles, social institutions, right? So everything around us is acting upon us. Now, these things don't have awareness, right? They don't have subjectivity. They don't have any intentions. They don't want to do things, right? But at the same time, they do have tendencies. So by tendencies, what I mean is that we can anticipate their behavior, right? So we can anticipate these things to behave in particular ways under certain conditions. So for example, if I had a mic here, which I do not, then if I come closer to the mic, then I can anticipate it to amplify my voice, right? So that's the mic's tendency if it's on and it's working, right? And this behavior of things affords certain possibilities of action. So, and that's the concept of affordances, right? Like the possibilities that things offer us. So for example, in the Tao Te Ching, we find that an empty room or an empty house invites us or offers us the possibility of lodging, right? So we can lodge in the house because it's empty, right? That's the affordance of emptiness, no? Or the usefulness or the utility of emptiness in the Tao Te Ching. Or in the Chuanzi, we find trees that give us a shade on which to lie down, right, and relax. So that's an affordance of the tree with the sun in certain position, right, under certain conditions. So such affordances of things, they can affect, inspire, encourage us to do things in particular ways. They can also forbid certain actions, right? So the classical example is the stop sign. Stop sign is forbidding you from moving forward, right, in traffic. But they can also prevent us without forbidding, but only prevent us from doing something, like a locked door prevents me from getting out of the room. And they can also enable us to do something like a door that is not unlocked. I can go in and out of the room, right? So those are the affordances. And so the thinking here is that whatever thing is entangled, interdependent, interconnected in a situation becomes an actor in that situation. Actor, agent, okay, same thing. I'm not making any difference in between those terms. They're also called actants, okay, sometimes because of the lack of intentionality to make it different. So anything becomes an agent in a situation, a participant of what is happening, right? Of the action that is being raised. Okay, so to better like imagine this idea or to entertain this idea, we can imagine riding a horse, okay? So while I can effortlessly differentiate between myself and a horse, I'm also aware that neither myself alone or the horse alone can raise the action of riding, right? Riding is a co-action between me and many other agencies, not only the horse, but also the ground, right, on which the horse is stepping, the open air that allows for movement, right, for moving forward. Also the food that we both have ingested and gives us energy, for example, right? Or we can think of the training that we have undergone, both of us, to be able to communicate, because otherwise, you know, without that training, we couldn't have any communication between the horse and myself, right? So all these agencies collaborate in raising the co-action of riding, right? Okay, so all these ideas are the heart of what in classical Chinese philosophy I have called the co-action paradigm, okay? So the co-action paradigm. And this co-action paradigm has 3 claims, which I'm gonna proceed to explain. The first claim is what I just said, that all actions are collective rather than individual, all right? So this is also been called intra-action and distributive action by Barad and Bennett, respectively, right? And the main idea is that there is no single subject as the root cause of any event, okay? There is no single subject to which an event or an action can be traced, not individual agents. So agency is always distributed across a plural field of agencies, right? There are human and non-human agents involved. So that's the first claim. Actions are always collective. There is no individual action. So that's why I call them co-actions, for example, right? And then the second claim is linked to the first one, and it says that obviously, as so if we are co-acting collectively with things, then we are saying that things have agency, right? Now, what does that mean, right? Things is everything that has no awareness, no intentionality, right? So what kind of agency would be the agency of things like an object or a landscape, right? Or an institution? It's not the same kind of agency that a human has, right? It's a different kind of agency. So what am I talking about when I say that things have agency? I'm understanding this, excuse me, this non-subjective, non-intentional form of agency in terms of efficacy and propensity, okay? And I'm gonna explain this too. So first, efficacy. Efficacy, you'll know this term, obviously. So when we are talking about intentional subjects, efficacy is to make the best use of available resources in order to achieve a goal. So I'm being effective when I know how to use my resources at hand, right? So, and then I accomplish my goal. But when we are not applying the concept of efficacy to intentional agents like humans, then efficacy simply means the capacity to effect a change, right? Efficacy means to make something happen, to cause something to happen, right? Or to create, to stimulate something to have a response, right? Which is what we can see through with the concept of gan yin, right, in Chinese, that we can translate in a very fancy way as resonance, right? There is a lot of resonance. It's becoming also very popular in Western non-Chinese influenced European philosophy, right? Which is funny. Anyway, so that resonance, examples. We can think, for example, with a Confucian model theory that certain kinds of music excite certain moods, right? So certain kinds of music may invite peaceful reflection and relaxation, and other music may instigate rebellion and violence, right? So that's causing an effect, asking for a response, making something happen, right? Then we can also think, based on the political philosophy of Shen Dao and Han Feizi, that it's the position of the ruler and not his character, his virtue, his experience or his training, what gives him the capacity to effectively have use of power and authority, right? It's the position of the ruler that gives him authority, right? So that's making something happen. Okay, so that's for efficacy. Now, to think about propensity as another way in which we can think of things having agency. Again, propensity is that tendency to behave in certain ways, right? That I was talking about before. But if we, instead of thinking of things in isolation, as this individual thing, if we think of things in terms of assemblies or assemblages, right? Collections of things that come together, then propensity is like the emergence of a collective power, is a capacity to self-organize by harmonizing with others, right? So then that harmonization in Chinese would be he, right? And propensity would be shi, the concept of shi, the power, the emergent power of a situation. An example of it would be with natural entities in the finances, no? When we see this very beautiful example of the self-sustainability of the world, where you have different natural entities in a niche environment, like rain and birds in a tree, and the rain and the wind, and water and river. So all these natural entities are harmonizing with each other to nourish each other, right? To support each other and to help each other thrive. And they do all that without any plan or any intention to do so, right? It just happens as a collective emergent power, right? Okay, so in this account of agency, neither efficacy nor propensity necessitate a subject as the main operator in the process. We don't need a person to make things happen, right? To have this agency, they can do things on their own, right? But then, of course, when humans participate in acting along with things and co-raising courses of action, then we have something else. We have something more than just resonance or harmonization at play. Why? Because suddenly we have an agent with intentions, right? Which makes things very different. So that's what leads us to the third claim in the co-action paradigm, which says that in co-raising courses of action along with others, humans, qua intentional agents, have to adapt to the tendencies, the affordances, the behavior of the things that they are acting with, all right? So that notion of acting along with things, that's what in classical Chinese philosophy is called in, right? What Tom was saying before, in-way, the in, right? That concept, even though there are other terms that also indicate adapting, right? So I translate it as adapting, is the capacity to act along with things. And there is a metaphor that I particularly enjoy to explain how adapting works, that speaks of riding the power of things, right? Like the wingless dragon may ride on clouds and use the wind in order to fly and to travel between places, right? So you don't have that power, but you are harnessing the power of things. You're acting along with others, no? So adaptive actions are those that acknowledge the interdependence of everything in a given situation, that acknowledge the agency of things in terms of efficacy and propensity, and then as a consequence, they're able to put the power of things to good use, right? So in a nutshell, then the idea in the third claim is that humans must adapt ourselves to the agentive power of the things that we are acting with, okay? So, for example, very popular example with the trans butchered Dean, right? Which I'm sure most of you know the story of butchered Dean or cooked Dean, right? So he's cutting this ox, and in cutting the ox, he's adapting to the particular configuration of the piece of ox, right? The particular piece of ox that he has in front of him. And in the story, he said not to see with his eyes or listen with his ears, because these perceptual processes are supposed to are understood as reifying, objectifying things, and positing them as external objects of confrontation upon which we exert some violence, right? So instead of doing that, Butcherdin, it's like kind of resonating, right, with the piece of meat that he has in front of him, adapting to the particular configurations that he can see. And that's how he becomes highly effective, right? As opposed to all the other cooks and butchers, right? With the knives that don't work, etc., right? And then there is many examples for the non-subjective forms of agency. Many examples we can find in The Art of War, right? The Art of War, also a very popular text. There we see all the time, right? That the commander, that an effective action is never an individual action. The commander is always designing strategies, adapting to others, right? And these others are things like mountain ranges, or climate conditions. Is it raining, right? Or is it too hot? And things like fire and water, right? The terrain conditions, is there a river here? Everything, right? So the commander cannot act on its own, because any of these things that I have named can trump his strategy, right? Unless the strategy is an ad hoc response to exactly the conditions he's dealing with. So the commander in the art of war is said to be like water, right? So it has to fluidly adapt to shifting conditions, continuously shifting conditions. All right, so then the question now would be, how do we do all this, right? How do we become adaptive agents? How can we learn to harness the power of things, right? And there are several keys in the classical Chinese texts to understand how to train, right, to become more adaptive agents. So I'm going to give you a couple of these keys, right? And the first one would be to displace our sense of self, to displace ourselves, no? Because we take ourselves to be a preferred prioritary source of preferences, reasons, and values, right? We take ourselves seriously, let's say, not in other way. And so instead of doing that, instead of taking ourselves to be so central, to displace the self would be to consider ourselves just as one more element in an interconnected, network of elements in a situation, right? So we are not even the main element or the main standard by which to judge which course of action would be more important, more effective, right, or more valuable for a particular situation. So this is called in some texts forgetting, right? The notion of forgetting the self. It's also called emptying the heart mind, right? With that notion of Shin. Emptying the heart mind is that combination of both the locus of emotions and the locus of reasons, right? And so the rationale here is that if we take ourselves to be so central, right? If we're so full of ourselves, we can say, then it's hard to invite others in, right? And it can be hard we can even become blind to what everything in our immediate environment can offer us, right? And what are the needs and the tendencies of things, which may lead to acting in forceful ways, right? Imposing our will no matter what, even if it's not adequate and a good fit for the situation and the context in which we are, right? So displacing the self also means to gain a little bit more of sensitivity, right, to context, right? So that we don't act so forcefully. Because, classical Chinese philosophers, they don't agree on a whole lot of things, but they do agree that individualistic, forceful actions that are not context sensitive always lead to harm, to chaos, right? And also to clumsy actions, to ineffective action, right? Okay, so that's one of the points, to become more adaptive. Then there is another important point, that an adaptive agent is never gonna follow strictly any pre-established guidelines for behavior, right? Because no two situations are ever the same. No two situations have the same emergent collective power, right? So if you want to harness that power, then you cannot come into a situation already knowing what you're going to do, right? You have to design your plan on the spot, right, in the moment. So a plan of action is going to be successful only insofar as it is an ad hoc response to a temporary set of circumstances, right? Now, there is another image for this, which is very famous too, which is the mirror image, right? So it says to use your heart mind as a mirror, which means that the mirror, it reflects everything that it encounters without any kind of judgment, any kind of expectations, right? But then as things move on, then the mirror doesn't store those shapes. It lets them go, right? So it's a sort of forgetting, right, the shapes, letting them go, emptying itself of the shapes that it just encountered. And so the mirror doesn't, like our heart minds or ourselves, we don't become too rigid, right? So we don't create preconceptions and expectations, and we don't become inflexible in our and lose that kind of that fluidity, right, to respond to situations, right? Okay, and then precisely on this point, there is the parable of the hare and the hanfei, right? Hare meaning like the big rabbit, which is also very famous. All the texts I'm talking about are very famous. So this this is a humoristic one, no? It's kind of sarcastic. So there is this man from the state of Sun that is out in the field and then witnesses a rabbit that bumps into a tree and breaks its neck and dies, right? And the man is happy about it because I suppose because that's like free food, right? I didn't have to work for it, right? I'm getting the rabbit and I can eat it. And then, so he's happy and he says, well, now I'm just gonna, keep waiting here for another rabbit to die. And that man is presented as a ridiculous figure, right? It's someone that we can laugh at very comfortably, right? We don't need to be shy about laughing at the man of Sun. It's like a joke, right? But at the same time, I think that we can also, all of us, we can recognize ourselves a little bit in the man of Sun, no? Because we also have, we expect things to unfold in the same way as we have experienced in the past, right? We have some expectations about how things are supposed to go, and then we make plans accordingly to those expectations, right? Or often we jumped into generalizations without having sufficient evidence, no? Or we're always searching for some kind of reliable standards to guide our actions, right? We need standards, we need to know how to act, right? So, for example, we may have certain fundamental values that we cherish very much, and then make these values become some kind of universal guide, right? Movable pillars that help us decide in between different courses of action, especially in situations of conflict, right? So we're not so different from the man of Sun. Now, who is very different from the man of Sun, you may be wondering, and then that's Confucius. Confucius is presented. I know you were wondering, Tom. So, so the man of Sun is all of us, right? And then the one who's actually different is Confucius, the greatest sage of all times, right? So Confucius, in the Analects, it says, Confucius is always on the side of what is right, but he doesn't really know what is right, in the sense that what is right changes along with situations, right? So he's on the side of what is right, and he always seeks to do what is right, but then he says that there is nothing that he invariably accepts or rejects, affirms or denies, right? Confucius claims in first person in the Analects to have no preconceptions about what's right and wrong, possible or impossible. He has no preconceptions. And he claims that that's precisely what separates him from all the other aspiring sages, like influential moral and political figures in his times, right? So it's this capacity to waver, this not knowing, right? This inconstancy that makes him the greatest sage of all, that not knowing what's going to be right until facing a situation, right? And there are many passages that are, speak to this point, like when Confucius gives different advice on the same question by two different disciples, right? Two different students. Why? Because the situation will be different. What is right for one person is not going to be right for the other, right? So he's always acting alone, all the other persons and also elements in his context. But it's a funny thing that is Confucius's inconstancy, what made him a great sage, because inconstancy is not something that we typically value, right? I wouldn't say like we don't go, we don't admire people for being inconstant. I couldn't say that. Or we don't, praise people for being unreliable or non-committal, right? Much the other way around, right? So this inconstancy as a virtue is something pretty unique, but also we need to realize that Confucius's inconstancy, his capacity to waver, and to change his mind, right? It's not individualistic. It's not forceful. It's not him or arbitrary, right? He's not imposing arbitrarily whatever he feels like in that day. It's a result actually of his adaptability, right? He's working along with things, right? And with other human agents too, all right? Okay, so now I'd like to give you another example of adapting, this time with a manuscript that I have become kind of obsessed with in the past couple of years, and that is called the Ute Yosintu. It's a manuscript from Wandui, and it's a silk manuscript, right? The title translates into entities necessarily have forms. And as you may know, the standard way of reading a manuscript in classical China, whether it is a bamboo manuscript that you would open like this, or a piece of silk, you could read top to bottom and left to right, no? So that's the standard way, but not for readers of the Utseyoshin, because this is a silk manuscript with a round design in the middle. And in order to decipher the text that is in the round design, you have to rotate the manuscript in your hands in a clockwise direction, and then read the text from the inside outwards, right? So that's very complicated. And I owe the discovery of this manuscript to our friend and colleague, Luke Warren. So I wanted to acknowledge that and recognize his work. And so it's a very complicated way of reading a manuscript. It's not only weird and difficult for us today, but also it would have been also for classical Chinese readers, right? But precisely because it's so difficult and so strange, because you have to make an effort to read the manuscript in that way, with the rotational operation, that's what makes it a very good example of co-acting and adaptive co-acting, right? So the manuscript, that is, by the way, it's a performative text. So it performs what it says. And what it says is that there is no actions that are purely inner, right? And by inner, I take it to mean coming individually from one entity, right? So from myself, right? So obviously, I don't decide on myself to read the manuscript through the rotational operation. That's not my choice, right? But at the same time, actions don't come either purely from the outside, what the manuscript calls the outside, which be the external world, right? Because the manuscript is not really forcing me to read it. So there is neither conventional heteronomy nor conventional autonomy. It's something in between, right? So the event of reading the Utseyoshin manuscript is a co-action, an adaptive co-action, right? Myself as a person, as the intentional agent, I am the one who has to adapt to the features, the tendencies, the affordances of the manuscript if I want to effectively read the text, right? So, of course, you're thinking that happens with any action of reading, not only with this manuscript, because if I'm going to hold a book upside down, then I'm not going to be able to read it either, right? So I'm still co-acting with the book, but in a very ineffective way, because I'm not adapting to the book's tendencies, right? So this happens with every effective action, that we are adaptively co-acting along with others, no? What I think that the manuscript does very well, and that's the power, the pedagogical power that this manuscript has, is that by making this extra effortful rotational operation in performing the content of the text, it's nudging the reader to realize the extent to which the external world kind of constitutes and is part of what we may conceive as our individual actions, right? So it's helping us understand that. That's what I think it's doing. And then that's something that games do very well too, like any kind of games, sports, or any other kinds of games. If you're familiar with contemporary philosopher T. Wien's theory from games as agency repositories, it's very interesting. I recommend it. So he says that whenever we are playing a game, imagine a basketball game, okay, we have to fix our agency to fit the, so we have to suspend our ordinary values, goals, and means to achieve those goals, right? And then we have to acquire temporary new ones. So suddenly I'm very interested in putting a ball through a net, which is not something that, usually in my ordinary life, unless I'm playing the game, I'm interested in doing, right? So I'm adopting a new goal, but then I'm also flexing my agency to adopt new means to achieve those goals, right? Because there are certain rules. I cannot put the ball through the net in any way, right? There are certain rules I have to follow. So I think that if we use a co-action framework to think about this, it's very useful, right? Because it helps us realize the extent, how easy it actually is for us sometimes to adapt to even very unusual demands, like only use your feet to move a ball across a field, right? That's very unusual, right? A demand to put on ourselves. It's not easy to do, but we are very easy to adapt, right? We're gonna play the game, we just follow those rules. So we're constantly adapting to tendencies in our environment to act with efficacy, right? So I think games, both games and the Utseyosin manuscript are very helpful in helping us realize that, right? And they're both examples help us like raise awareness, right, of adaptive co-action, and that is something that we do continuously, right? So that's my transition also into the last section of my talk. It's going to be short. Okay, so it seems like a trivial insight, no, that we continuously adapt to the tendencies of things in order to co-act along with them. If you think about it, we do it all the time. I'm doing it right now, you too, as we are breathing, as we are talking, as we are reading a book, whatever we are doing, right? So what could be then more interesting is to think about how adaptive co-action applies to planning for actions that are not so trivial or ordinary, but actions that have a larger political, social, or perhaps environmental impact in all of us, no? So I think precisely it is at this social political level where co-action, no, becomes more relevant, more central, that it can really help us rethink a lot of stuff that has a lot of impact on our ordinary daily lives. Because if we acknowledge the extent to which human agency is distributed, right, across this plural field of actors, then they can't really keep acting as if we were fully autonomous agents in the conventional sense of autonomy, right, which is a very individualistic sense, right? So we're radically not self-reliant. No, that's my point. We're not self-reliant. So why are we acting as if we were, right? And we judging others as if they were, right? So under the ideology of individualism, we find things like people are blamed for what seem to be like individual choices, right, all the time. Like, for example, drug addicts, now they're blamed for their weakness, for example. Or pregnant women who choose not to become mothers are blamed for their recklessness or immorality or whatever it is. The unemployed are condemned for their laziness. Immigrants are accused of stealing other people's jobs or other people's resources, right? The poor are despised for their lack of effort or their lack of merit, no? So there is a lot of attention to individual choices here, as if these individual choices were sourced to some kind of metaphysical individual freedom that we have, right? And I think this is due to a mistaken account of agency, an account of agency where our actions are the direct result of our intentions and our will, right? So it's an account of agency where we do exactly what we want, where we are in full power, right? Where we are completely self-reliant and have a lot of efficacy, right, in dealing with the world and engaging in actions. But as the sociologist Peter Calero has remarked, even if I theoretically have the right to vote, can I really vote if I don't have a voting station close by, right? Or if I have to work on election day, as it is the case for so many people, because voting is a co-action, no? That is the result as much of my desire to cast a vote as of a lot of laws, institutions, and objects and resources that enable me to cast my vote, right? Vote is in a co-action. So if I can't vote, if I do not vote, perhaps it's not something that can be sourced only to my individual will, right, or preferences. So as a thing, and we said anything that has no intentionality or subjectivity is a thing, right? So the ideology of individualism is also a thing. And as a thing, it has its own affordances and its own tendencies, right, to behave in particular ways. And it also has its own form of non-intentional agency. It has efficacy and propensity, right? And I think the efficacy, or part of the efficacy of individualism, to me at least, like the most corrosive perhaps aspect of it, is that it blinds us completely to that network of agents, right? To all the resources, institutions, ideas, laws that we need in order to do what we want to do and to become who we want to become, both individually as a society, right? So it's individualism is very effective, right, in making us see social reality in just one particular way, I would say, right? It's a very effective ideology, I have to give it that. And then, the efficacy of relationality, right, on the other hand, is the opposite, right? It makes us see, it helps us see that extended network of agents that are continuously enabling our actions or preventing our actions, right? Participating, influencing our actions in many different ways, no? So it helps us see all these structures that enable some people to succeed, like growing up in a safe neighborhood with good public schools, right? And also the structures that prevent other people from succeeding, right? And from having flourishing lives, like, for example, not having access to a safe abortion, right? When you need one, right? So in order to more justly attribute responsibility, guilt, and merit across all plural actors and entangled actors, and also to design social systems whose power enables more equitable and nurturing paths now for everyone for the future, I think we can turn our look to these others that participate in our agency, right? And that's an invitation that I take from classical Chinese philosophers. I think classical Chinese philosophy is really, inspiring in helping us see things differently. And for me, it's certainly done it with agency, right? And another thing so it's an invitation, right, to rethink our notion of agency and agents. And another thing to point out is that this notion of agency being collective and collectively distributed doesn't intend to take control away from humans, right? Which is a common critique, right? So because it's counterintuitive, but it's precisely in acknowledging that we are not in full control that we can actually control the courses of action that we choose, that we select as more fitting, and also the outcomes of those actions. And also even that we can have like a greater imaginative scope to imagine societies that can work better at the level of institutions and structures that will allow everyone to flourish. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for a very stimulating talk, Mercedes, and certainly a lot to think about. And I have lots of my own questions I'd very would love to ask, but I'll start with one of our graduate students, Leslie Huang, who asks this question. Is relationality taken as a given in early Chinese thought and philosophy, or is there a component where the individual must be made self-aware of their dependency on other entities, human and non-human? In other words, how are we made aware of this, and how is this relationality framed as being expansive versus being restrictive? And just to reiterate what I mentioned in the chat for everyone while Mercedes thinks about her response, you can put questions in the chat, or you can raise the hand and I'll just call on you and you can ask directly. Okay, go ahead, Mercedes.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Leslie, I think. It's a fantastic question because I think it's we can very easily fall into simplistic dichotomic thinking and saying the West is like this and Asia or China is like that, right? So the West is essentialistic and individualistic, and China is all about relationality and interdependence. And I think in general terms, in very general terms, that's kind of right. But at the same time, in the West and the Western and the Asian traditions are not monolithic traditions, right? You have everything. So you find pretty much everything in every single tradition and culture. So I would say for classical Chinese philosophy, relationality, it's something that is more prominent, more extended, right? More mainstream, let's say, than it is in the West, right? Or it has been historically in the West, right? I should say. But in the Western tradition, there's also been lots of advocates of relationality since the early times, right? And there is a lot of exchange and possibilities for doing that kind of comparative work. And also in Europe, right, since the 20th century, there's also under a lot of influence of Asian philosophy, there is like this shift towards relationality, right? And all French authors, right, are relational, and it's becoming very popular. But to your question, in classical China, it's a more mainstream concept than it has been in the dominant Western tradition, but still is not a given. And why I dare to say that, right? Because when you see texts making arguments and trying to get people to think in relational terms, then it's that they had to persuade someone that that's how things are, or how they want people to see things, right? So if it were a given and self-evident, then probably no one would need to talk about it, right? So if you talk about it, then you're persuading someone, you're elaborating on an argument, you're trying to create a way of framing reality, no? So I hope that helps answer the question.
Thanks. Yeah, and one thing I just want to highlight before we get to Zoya's question is that I think something that's really interesting about your book and your talk that you gave is how you look at the level, as you say in the book, at the level of arguments rather than classified by different schools or different texts or even chapters within texts, that you're sort of reading across different texts. And because I think typically a lot of people would attribute this concept mainly to Taoists or Zhuangzi, or would note the appearance of these ideas in Han Feizi, say, as a Taoist sort of influence. And what's interesting is how you note it across very many different types of texts and arguments. So anyway, just want to highlight that for everyone. All right, Zoya, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. I don't know why that button doesn't work for me. Thank you very much this is really fascinating. And because I do theory of knowledge in the middle period, I would say I really agree with you almost 100% on all the main ontological and epistemic assumptions that you are stating as, a characteristic of Chinese thought. So I have a question. The short version is, can we still talk about power in the picture you're presenting? So this is a short one. And the long way I would like to ask is this. So I'm totally in agreement in that the whole ontological picture is more of a global interconnectivity instead of privileging any specific centers with intentionality or subjective intentionality. So I'm definitely in agreement with that. But I'm also considering situations where, and almost in all situations when we're describing any co-action as you're describing, we're still making a selective focus on something, as if we are putting something or some things in spotlight as a choice or a focus. So this is the reason why I'm thinking, so how do we strike a balance between emphasizing the global interconnectivity on the one hand, but also then make sense of our choices or whose choice is that's if we're really like neutralizing egalitarian, making everything egalitarian in terms of agency. So that's why, hence my question of power. But this is something I was thinking while you were talking. So I remember this is something I recently read. Someone discussed the case of road rage, which is really fascinating, about a discussion of affordance, as you were talking about that. So a person who's really angry, like say I'm really angry at the person who's the driver before me, but I could be talking to other people in the car in a completely normal and calm way. And when I get out of the space of the car, I would still be able to act normally and calmly. And yet that road rage is the captivating moment where the space of a car has somewhat absorbed me, or one way or another co-adapted to create that moment. But this goes back to my point. It's not even to talk about the car and me in a general sense. It's a highly selective moment that is a very highly specific interaction that happens. So I hope this is not too long a way of asking, but this is just my curiosity in terms of how you would respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting reflections and comments. So I totally agree that for a situation even to emerge, we need to select some things to come to the foreground, right? And to leave everything else in the background, right? So as like right now, I'm focusing so much on you, right? And in what you're saying and in what I want to say, and especially those of you with the cams on, right? I'm focusing a lot in your faces, right? And I'm completely oblivious until this moment of the room I'm in, right? Perhaps the chair, because the chair is enabling me like affect my agency, right? I'm moving along with it, but everything else until this minute had disappeared completely, right? And the air that we are continuously breathing to keep us alive, we never think about it unless you need more, right? Or it becomes unfitting in some way, right? Too thick, or there's too much smoke or something, no? So we're always selecting, and that's actually something that I discuss in that paper called What is a Situation, right? So I talk about how situations are constructed, right? With the intentional agents that are, with their selective attention, they're bringing some things to the foreground among all the affordances that are available to us at any given moment, right? So we are selecting things. And the thing like with road rage and any other, the thing with adapting, I think, and the thing with those practices that I was mentioning of decentering the self, right, or emptying the self, it's also the capacity to break certain patterns. So when we are socialized, that's something that we also find in the trance a lot, right? When we are socialized into seeing things in a certain way, and also into certain patterns of behavior and emotions that may seem acceptable, right, in our society, because that's something also that actually I was discussing with my students very recently, that we tend to think about emotions like that rage that you feel in a car as a natural thing, like as the most pure of things, because it's like a natural spontaneous reaction to something. So philosophers and thinkers in general who distrust language because it constructs reality in particular ways, they praise when there is a dichotomy between the rational mind and the emotions, right? They praise emotions as being like this, the pure thing, the most genuine thing of humanity, because you cannot fake them, right? They just come out like that rage. But then we also find in classical Chinese philosophers and in contemporary, philosophy of emotions, the very interesting argument that emotions are just as constructed as anything else. You're habituated to emotionally react to certain things in certain ways. So if in this society it is accepted to feel rage, to feel anger when you are in a situation in traffic that is not convenient, then you react emotionally in that way, right? But if you're raised in a society where that is not acceptable, then you will tell your kids, right, to not feel anger, that they don't have the right to feel anger in certain situations, and they will learn to react emotionally in different ways. So these are arguments, I can disagree, right? But this is there is a theory of emotions being something that we do, and different cultures can do it differently, right? There is this book, How to Do Things with Emotions, by Owen, right? And it's great because it has like all this. It's very accessible, and also it has all these intercultural comparisons on how emotions are done differently in different cultures, right? So what I mean is that not only do we select with our attention, but what do we select? That's determined by how we have been socialized to look at the world, what matters to us, right? What we have grown to believe that matters, right? For different reasons, right? So this decentering of the self and emptying of the mind can also help break with certain patterns that may seem natural and obvious and self-evident to us, or the only possibility, when actually they are not. And they may help us see things not only differently, but see more possibilities in things, right? See things that were, obscured, like completely in the dark for us before. I don't know if that helps, but we are just one more element, right, in a situation. I don't think, you said that this makes things very egalitarian. I don't think that's the case, because the modes of agency between, things, non-intentional agency and humans is quite different, right? Even though we have also non-intentional forms of agency, we have the intentional one. And we are the only ones who can decide, well, I mean, so far as I understand the world, at least, right? There are animists who believe, the opposite, that things also have intentions and will. That's not, how I see things. But so we are the only intentional agents. Then we are the ones who can decide, how to act in certain situations, and we can choose to adapt, right, to those tendencies of things. So it's not completely egalitarian. There is a hierarchy, right, of agents, I would say. So it's distributed across a plurality of actors, but these actors are not all equal, right, in how they collaborate in the raising a co-action.
Thanks, Mercedes, for that answer. And just before I call on Kyle to talk, I just want to reflect a little bit too on how I've been working a lot with this concept of infrastructure lately, and I'm trying to think of what's the difference by framing something as infrastructure versus framing it as co-agentive as you do. I think infrastructure has a stronger emphasis on the hierarchy, right, of support and sort of things like that, but I think gets us to some similar places, but some different ones too. Anyway, just throwing that out there as
yes. I think you're right. I've also been thinking like this change of paradigm from individualism to relationality, which we can use different terms, right, to refer to these paradigms, but you know what I mean. I think it's also a shift from vertical ways of understanding co-action and more horizontal ways of understanding co-action without yet establishing a purely egalitarian, perspective necessarily, which it can be established, but not necessarily, right? You don't need it. We don't need it for it to work, for the theory to work. So I see a shift from structuralism and post-structuralism, right, which was very vertical, where infrastructure or resources or structures, institutions, though they were very passive, right? Very, very passive. And now, it's like, whoop, there's moving down, and there is a more horizontal line where we can see a more active role that these things take in our agency. I think that's a shift that is happening, that is been happening.
Yeah,
so I think that's a very good way to describe it, from vertical to horizontal.
Yeah. And the way I've been thinking about infrastructure too, that different things mean infrastructure depending. I was thinking like the systems thing that you were talking about too, with like the learning that's involved as part of the infrastructure and all this. Anyway, I do want to give Kyle a chance to ask this question. Kyle's one of our graduate students, and so go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah.
Thank you for the fascinating talk, Professor Mercedes Valmisa. It was great. I hear a lot of resonances with Buddhist thought, ideas around non-self, interdependence, and I'm curious about kind of the genealogy of these ideas, and I'm wondering if there's any sort of way in which interrelationality, agency, if the conversation shifted upon the Chinese contact with Buddhism. I know that's outside of your period of expertise, but I'm curious about how the discourse around this evolved over time.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a great question too, and there is a lot of resonance, like you said, between these ideas in the classical period before Buddhism got into China, and then as Buddhism got there, like how it really connected, and it was a very fruitful a combination. But that question, your professor Thomas, and I can answer it much better. I'm much influenced by Buddhist philosophy, I have to say, right, in my own thinking, and but like I'm not a historian, right? So like to trace the development of ideas and so on, there are other people in the room who can do that better than I can.
Thanks. I mean, I wouldn't dare to trace that lineage either. It would probably, an intellectual historian like Zoya would probably be the most qualified for that sort of thing. But in the comments, Diego left a sort of thank you for you in Spanish, and then Jaisel Atkins, who had to leave, asked this question. So thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I'm ordering your book. Speaking of Butcher Ding, what is the relationship with adapting and wu wei or non-action?
Yeah, fantastic question too, right? Because in some texts, actually, wu wei, non-action, appears defined as adapting, right? So, but that doesn't happen all the time, no? But there are some definitions of what's wu wei, right? So what I call wu wei is right, is adapting, to be able to adapt. That's to act in an wu wei manner, but it's not always the case. And I think they can still be differentiated. I think that wu wei can be a whole lot of things, right? So wu wei can be actions first that are effortless, right? Like when we talk about skillful spontaneity, right? Actions where the collective self, the body takes over, and the mind or the rational self is like put on a kind of standby, right? So it doesn't become an obstacle to very effective performance. Like again, when you're playing sports, right? So you go into a game and like those states of flow, right? In which you're fully present, much this kind of holistic awareness. So you're very attuned to a situation, highly responsive, but you are not really like rationally guiding every single action with your mind, right? And if you start doing that, then you know, like your performance suffers from it, right? So that's wu wei. In you know, that's a form of wu wei. But wu wei can also be indirect actions, right? Actions that in trying to achieve a goal, they take indirect means to achieve it, because you know that going just straight for it is not going to help, right? Like the very classic example is being insomniac and trying to put yourself to sleep, right? Like the more you try, the less that you're going to be able to sleep, right? So that's what Slingerland calls like trying not to try, right? How to try not to try, how to become effective at wu wei, no? So that's another form of wu wei. Can be a whole lot of different things in the classical text, right? And I think one of those things is being adaptive too, but it's not always like that. And also it's the same happens with adapting, because adapting is what I'm calling like a meta model of action. Ugly expression, but what I mean is that it doesn't refer to a particular course of action, like wu wei actions, for example. It can actually be any action, because an adaptive action is an action that is decided alone with the other entities, right, that are participating in it. So sometimes the most suitable and effective action is going to be for me to go in that wu wei mode, right? Like Saran, like no, that spontaneous kind of. But other times, no, I need my mind like right on, right? I need to be self-directing or doubting myself even to be highly effective. Or other times I may need to participate in ritual actions, right? Highly prescriptive actions that encourage rule following, which seems to be all the opposite of adapting, right? But sometimes that's the best thing you can do, right? Like the most effective response to a situation is to actually participate in a very principled ritual and not to deviate from it, right? So adapting is like that. That's what I mean by a meta model, that it's defined by its procedure on how to select an action rather than by its content. So wu wei and wu wei actions can sometimes be adaptive actions, and there is a lot of overlap in the texts.
I just also want to highlight one of the examples you give from your book in the introduction about the different ways of reading scholarship work. Maybe do you want to highlight that just because also this is also a grad methods class where we're reading and critiquing a lot of scholarship. So do you want to highlight that real quick?
Sure. So I think I use the examples of 3 different ways of reading an article. No, so you can read it with the purpose of undermining every single idea in the article, right? So that would be a forceful reader, we can say. No, so your purpose in reading the article is to find the weakness, no, of the author, right? Or you can read the article to as a total beginner to learn from it, right? So you're completely open-minded, and everything that the article says, you're like taking notes and like learning assimilating it. Or you can take what can be called a critical approach, right? In which you're trying to find solutions to a particular problem, academic or not. And then so you're reading the article in what we may call an objective way, right? So assessing weaknesses and strengths and assessing, the use of evidence and trying to really assess like what are the merits of the article and how to employ it for your own purposes, no? And that could be a critical reader, right? So an adaptive agent could do all those three readings of the article depending on the situation. So the forceful reader could be a graduate student, right? So imagine your professor is asking you to completely like crash me, right? So you're reading my article to find all the weaknesses in it, right? And that's a good exercise that you learn how to read very, very critically, but also very forcefully, no? So that can be your goal in reading the article. Or you're an undergraduate student, a total beginner, and you're reading the article to then go to a test and repeat, right, exactly what the author of the article had to say, because that's the only way your professor is going to give you an A, right? Or you can be a scholar, right, or an ordinary person. Scholars are not ordinary people. Who really trying to find different approaches to something, and that would be the critical reader. So adapting can be those three types of action and more, no? Because like I said, it's not a course of action per se, but a method for selecting the most suitable course of action for a particular context.
Thanks. Yeah, I found that to sort of help clarify the idea in my mind too. I just want to point out, Kyle left a comment here, sort of bringing up the possibility of determinism. And so he says that there's a lot of neuroscience work presently exploring free will as an epiphenomenal illusion within our conscious experience that substantiates reality on a neurobiological level as well. So I think this is getting back to, we could also phrase this as a question, right? At what point does this distributed agency shade completely into determinism? And what are your ways of sort of balancing, guarding against that concept creeping in?
Right. So if I understand the question, saying, well, if we accept the premise of determinism, then what we can or cannot do is already decided. Is that if there is no free will, no?
I don't know, Kyle, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to chime in. But yeah, I've heard of, I guess, like the kind of quintessential study exploring this was asking people to randomly move their left pinky while they're in an fMRI machine. And they found consistent patterns in terms of the electrical distribution in the brain 7 seconds prior to the pinky actually being moved. And so there was this kind of intention that lingered in some sort of subconscious space for the pinky to move seconds prior to it actually occurring within the person's conscious experience. And I guess just to kind of add on to Professor Mazanek, for me personally, I don't feel compelled to guard against determinism. I feel in some way that if determinism is what constitutes our kind of lived experience, then a part of me embraces it. And there's something I find kind of liberating about determinism from my personal perspective, but that emotional reaction isn't mine as well. But yeah, I don't know, I'm just offering that as kind of another kind of multidisciplinary perspective on what you shared.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I like that question a lot. So I feel I have no emotional reaction to determinism. I feel very comfortable with it. But I think that determinism, it's part of our social reality, right? Like everything else, right? You wanna, perceive the world and construct the world as being fully deterministic in a strong sense. That's a possibility. You wanna construct it as being fully deterministic, but still their existence and compatibility between determinism and free will. Thousands of philosophers, right, have developed that kind of compatibilism. Then you can do that, right? For me, all these ways of looking at the world are social constructions, right? So they are not closer or farther away from truth, right? That's why it doesn't bother me, because So they bother me when they have a negative impact in our lives, in how humans and the rest of the living creatures on the planet live. And that's why individualism as a social reality bothers me, right? Because I personally, you may disagree, of course, I believe that it has a very negative impact in our societies, right? And in our very personal lives. So if that's only a framework to look at reality, if it's a social fact and nothing that is closer to truth, because there is no such truth, right, to be close to or to deviate from, then why would we use it, right? It's like using a broken tool, just like get a new one, right, that is more effective, like replace it. We are not tied to our tools, right? We shouldn't be a slave to our thinking tools either. We shouldn't be slaves to our traditions and our ideologies, political or otherwise, right? So that's how I think about things. So determinism doesn't bother me because for me, it's completely compatible with the illusion of free will, right? Because the truth of the matter is that I have never met a person who has a experience of determinism in a strong sense. Like we all have the illusion of free will, whether it's again, true or not, right? Scientifically, for example, or neurologically. And we live with the illusion that we can choose, right? At the same time, we're becoming increasingly aware of the many determinations that we have and that constitute us, right? And that's part of like the kind of work that I do, that I wanna, become more aware of how I'm constituted by others, right? How other things, not only objects, but also ideas and ideologies or scientific systems and philosophical theories like determinism affect me and constitute me and create my identity and modify my behavior, right? So I want to understand that better. And I think it's fundamental that we understand that. But I think there are many tools and very interesting ways of making determinism compatible with free will. For example, I don't know if you know Daniel Dennett, very famous, right? And he has very famously argued for, what he says is that, I don't necessarily agree with that, but what he says, he makes a causal argument, which is to say, we need free will, right? It doesn't matter that free will does not exist because of the reasons, Kyle, that you were saying, right? Like scientifically and so on. It doesn't matter. We need to believe that we are free, or otherwise we'll become morally irresponsible, right? We'll become careless. And then, so he believes that very strongly. So he says, so if we need to believe in free will, all we have to do is to redefine free will in a way that fits our understanding, our scientific understanding of the world. I do agree with that part. And that's the thing about, replacing your tool. So do you think you need free will for some reason? Then just like create a definition of free will that is consistent with your worldview, and that will help you. That's how I see things.
Thanks. And how adaptive of a response. So now one of our alumna, Sarah Babcock, has a question. Oh, and you're muted still, Sarah. Sorry.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I have a kind of two-part question. I think, while the idea of adapting and working in a harmonious way with other people and the environment is really appealing to me, there's a little part of me that worries about the part of individuality that I associate with independent thinking, which in this concept, there probably isn't an independent thinking, but for example, that's required to call out problems, whistleblowers, going against mob mentality. And so I'm just wondering if this kind of agency involved in the co-adaptability would include that ability to bring about change when it really rubs against sort of the trends of the time. Mm-hmm. And a related question, I think it's related, is for this to work, we need to have some shared agreed upon principles? So like when we're thinking about Confucius, even though he's very adaptable and kind of inconstant, is there some things that are constant in order for that to actually work? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. These are great questions too. And I understand that it's it's a common concern, right? That it comes as a reaction to, listening to these ideas about going along with things or working along with things. It may seem, right, that it's saying, well, just go along with things, that then you're not opposing things, or you cannot work to change things, right? But it's not like that at all, right? It's far from it. So the thing with independent thinking, for example, right, that you mentioned, it depends how you're understanding independent, right? So are you understanding independent as its source to just myself as an individual entity, right? It's are my thoughts my own? Am I the sole cause and originator, creator of my thoughts? If that's the meaning of independent in independent thinking, then my answer would be not at all, right? All your thoughts are co-created by 1,000 things, starting with the language that you speak, right? And the books that you have read when you were a kid, the school you went to, everything, right? The culture, society, everything. So there is no such thing as independent thinking in that sense, right? But that doesn't mean that there cannot be independent thinking in the sense of critical thinking or thinking against the norm, right? And thinking against the norm is it's precisely the opposite. It's encouraged, right? And it's something that adapting can support. Why? Because as we were seeing before a little bit with this notion of emptiness, right? Decentering the self and breaking patterns, that it really, what it does, it's it prevents you from only seeing things in one particular way, right? In the particular way that you have been conditioned, socialized, right, to look at things. And it helps you, all these practices of emptiness and forgetting in classical China, they help you like take a step back, right? They talk about forget the values, forget the norms, forget the culture, the rituals, forget everything that is the virtues, right? Even the good things, no? Forget everything, take a step back and realize that all those things are, created by humans, right? None of those things are absolute or necessary. They're contingent upon, how we agree things to be, right? And they shift with the times. And they knew this in classical China, and they didn't have a lot of history behind them yet, right? that they knew of. Because there were not so many written records, from the previous civilizations. But we can look at that, right, as how contingent all of our ideas and ways of looking at the world are, right? How dependent they are upon everything, right, in our context. So taking that step back, actually, that notion of nothingness or emptiness is the potentiality to forget how things are supposed to be, within a certain normative paradigm, and allowing them to show other affordances that that were not visible from your perspective. And in doing that, then that can promote really the critical independent thinking as critical thinking, if that makes sense. But it's a very common, reaction, and I understand why, of course. But it's, it's not related to that at all. It's not a philosophy. The philosophy of adapting is not encouraging people to just accept things as they are, accept the status quo, right? What it encourages you is to acknowledge what you have in front of you, right? And how you learn to see things, and then to acknowledge how, how things are showing you to also be different, right? So acknowledge, but not accept passively. And in acknowledging, then we can have more control, right? And more power, as going back to Toya's question before that, I think I didn't address, can we still talk about power, right? I think we would need to redefine power and redefine control too.
Thanks. Yeah, and that a very tough question. So we're getting close to time, but if there's anyone has a final question or so, any other lingering thoughts, questions that you want to share, or even my students, because this is this is in theory a bibliography and methods class. Any questions about method for Mercedes? Pause for a few seconds just to see if anything bubbles up. If not, I know it's late there, out east, and you've had a long day, so I do want to be respectful of your time, Mercedes. But I do really appreciate this talk, and I learned a lot from it, and I hope our students did too. So let's give another round of applause for Mercedes.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for all your questions, very thoughtful and very relevant, all of them. So I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully, someday in the near future, acknowledge, not accept. Yeah, that I can be with you in person sometime. But thank you so much, and thank you, Tom, for organizing all this. My pleasure, absolutely.
All right. See you.
All right.